Have you ever heard the sound of ultimate betrayal? It's not a scream or a gunshot. It's the hollow, metallic echo of your own footsteps in a house where you spent 40 years, only to realize that every single memory you owned has been sold for parts. My family didn't wait for me to die. While I was in a rehabilitation center, struggling to regain the use of my left leg after a stroke, my wife and children turned my life into a digital garage sale. They sold my soul on Facebook Marketplace for pennies on the dollar, convinced that the old man was a broken relic who would never step foot inside his sanctuary again. 2 months ago, my world narrowed down to the white ceiling of a hospital room. A minor stroke, the doctor said. I was 62, fit for my age, but my body had betrayed me for a moment. My wife, Martha, sat by my bed with tears that I now realize were purely performative. My 2 grown children, Emily and David, patted my hand and told me, "Dad, don't worry about a thing. Focus on your recovery. We'll take care of the house. We've got everything under control." I believed them. I fought through the grueling physical therapy sessions with one goal in mind: getting back to my sanctuary. I wanted to smell my old jazz records, feel the weight of my grandfather's tools in my workshop, and sink into my leather wingback chair. Before we continue with the chilling reality of what I found behind those doors, consider subscribing to the channel. I share these stories so you can learn from my mistakes and see how justice is served in the most unexpected ways. Your support helps me keep telling these truths. When the taxi finally dropped me off in front of my driveway, I felt a surge of triumph. I walked to the door, slightly limping, but standing tall. I turned the key, expecting the familiar scent of floor wax and old books. Instead, I was hit by the smell of industrial lemon cleaner and a terrifying emptiness. The foyer was bare. My antique coat rack? Gone. The Persian rug we bought on our honeymoon? Gone. I stumbled into the living room, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a wasteland. No sofa, no TV, and worst of all, the wall-to-wall mahogany shelving that held my collection of 4,000 vinyl records was stripped bare. It looked like the house had been looted by professional thieves, but the locks weren't broken. This wasn't a robbery. This was an eviction of my entire existence. My family had erased me while I was still breathing. I stood in the center of the hollow living room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every corner of the house felt like a fresh wound. I forced my weak leg to carry me toward the back of the house, toward my sanctuary, the workshop. I pushed the heavy oak door, praying that at least my tools, the heavy iron wrenches and the vintage saws I'd spent decades restoring, were still there. The room was empty. Even the heavy workbench had been dragged out, leaving deep, ugly gouges in the wooden floor. It was as if they had tried to scrub my very essence out of the foundation. Just then, I heard the front door click open. Laughter echoed through the hallway, the bright, carefree laughter of my daughter Emily, and the low murmur of my wife, Martha. They walked in carrying shopping bags from expensive boutiques, looking like they didn't have a care in the world. When Martha saw me standing there, gaunt and trembling in my wrinkled hospital clothes, she didn't rush to hug me. She didn't cry with relief. She stopped dead, her face twisting into an expression of pure, unadulterated annoyance. "Quote 1, she asked, her voice as cold as a winter morning. "Quote 2, I managed to choke out, gesturing to the void around us. Emily stepped forward, tossing her bags onto the floor where my favorite rug used to be. She said, rolling her eyes. I looked at them, the people I had worked 60 hours a week for, the people I had sacrificed my youth to provide for, and I realized I wasn't a father or a husband to them. I was a liquidated asset. They had already moved on to a life where I was just a ghost in a small apartment, out of sight and out of mind. Martha crossed her arms, looking at me not with love, but with the clinical detachment of a landlord dealing with a difficult tenant. "The realtor is coming tomorrow, Frank. Don't make this difficult. You're tired, you're sick, and you're clearly not thinking straight. Just go sit on the porch while we figure out where you're going to sleep tonight." They hadn't just sold my things, they had sold my dignity. That night, I was forced to sleep on a cheap air mattress in the corner of my own master bedroom. Martha didn't even offer me a pillow. She just went into the guest room and locked the door. I lay there in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, one of the few things they hadn't sold yet, and felt a cold, hard knot forming in my chest. The sadness was gone. In its place was a sharp, calculating clarity. I realized that if I wanted to survive, I had to stop being the victim and start being the man I used to be before the stroke. Around midnight, I heard Emily's boyfriend, a smug kid named Tyler, come over. They were in the kitchen, whispering and laughing. I crept toward the door, my limp barely audible on the bare floorboards. Through the crack in the door, I saw Tyler leaning against the counter. My heart stopped. On his wrist was a heavy, gold-trimmed watch. It was my father's 1958 Omega. It was supposed to be in a locked safe in my study. Tyler chuckled, admiring the way the light hit the gold. I retreated back into the shadows, my blood boiling. I waited until they finally went to bed, and the house fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. I found Martha's laptop sitting on the kitchen island. She had never been good with passwords. It was always our anniversary. I logged in, and my stomach turned. Her Facebook Marketplace history was a graveyard of my life. There was my 1970s Technics turntable, sold for $50. My professional-grade wood lathe, gone for $100. My entire vinyl collection had been sold in 10 to random strangers. But then I saw the messages. Martha had been talking to a local realtor for weeks, even before I was discharged. She wrote in one message, quote 11. She wasn't just clearing out clutter. She was erasing my legal standing. She thought I was mentally incompetent. She was planning to gaslight me into a nursing home and pocket the entire equity of a house I had paid off 15 years ago. They thought I was a ghost, but I was about to become their worst nightmare. The sun rose the next morning, casting long, mocking shadows across the empty rooms. I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching Martha and Emily glide around like they were already the victors. They spoke about me in the third person, as if I were a piece of broken furniture sitting right in front of them. "He looks confused," Martha whispered to Emily. "We should probably move the signing to this afternoon while he's still in this fog." I kept my face blank. I let my hand tremble slightly when I picked up my mug. I needed them to believe I was fading. In reality, I was waiting for them to leave. The moment the garage door closed and their car pulled away, I moved with a speed I didn't know I still possessed. I reached into the back of the pantry, behind a loose brick I'd installed years ago. My fingers found the cold metal of a small USB drive and a thick manila envelope. Inside that envelope was my secret weapon, the deed to the house and my grandfather's original will. Martha had assumed the house was joint property, but it wasn't. This land had been in my family for 3 generations. I had inherited it before we ever said "I do," and the prenuptial agreement I'd insisted on, much to her annoyance back then, was ironclad. According to the law, she didn't have the right to sell a single floorboard without my notarized signature. I called an old friend, Arthur, a retired lawyer who knew where all the skeletons were buried in this town. When I told him what they had done, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Quote 16, he finally said, his voice trembling with a mix of pity and rage. I replied, looking at the scratches on my floor. We spent the next 3 hours mapping out the legal minefield. By the time I hung up, I had a list of every person who had, quote, 20 my life on Marketplace. I wasn't going to just sue my family. I was going to make the law hunt them down for me. To the outside world, I was still the confused old man shuffling through the empty hallways. When Martha returned later that afternoon, she was accompanied by a sharp-dressed man in a navy suit. "Frank, this is Mr. Henderson, the realtor," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "He's just here to take some photos of the layout. Why don't you go sit in the backyard? The fresh air will be good for your head." I nodded obediently and limped outside, but I didn't sit on the porch. I sat on a stump near the garage where I could see through the window into my old office. I watched them walk through the house, pointing at the walls, discussing quote 24 quote and quote 25 quote. They were talking about my home like it was a carcass they were preparing to butcher. But while they were dreaming of commissions and new apartments, I was working. I had Martha's old iPad, which she'd forgotten was synced to her phone. I sat in the shade and scrolled through her private messages. My heart grew colder with every swipe. She wasn't just selling my things, she was mocking me. She had a group chat with Emily and David titled The New Chapter. In it, they shared photos of my things being loaded into strangers' trucks. Martha had sent a photo of my vintage 1960s Fender amplifier with the caption, quote, 27, quote. That amplifier was worth at least $3,000. They were so desperate for quick cash that they were practically giving my life away. But then I saw a message from David, my son, that made my blood turn to ice. Quote, "They weren't just waiting for me to be weak. They were actively trying to strip me of my legal personhood. They wanted to turn me into a ward of the state so they could control my bank accounts. They had no idea that Arthur had already pulled my medical records from the rehab center. The doctors had cleared me as mentally sharp and fully cognizant 2 days before my release. My family was building a trap, but they were the ones about to walk into it. The next few days were a masterclass in deception. I continued to play the role of the broken man, leaning heavily on my cane and staring blankly at the walls. I even let Martha help me sign a few documents that she claimed were for my insurance. In reality, I knew they were the preliminary papers for the house sale. What she didn't realize was that I was signing them with a signature that didn't match my legal one on file at the bank or the county office. It was a small detail, but it would make those documents worthless when the time came. While Martha was busy with her realtor, I was making secret trips to Arthur's office. We weren't just looking at the house, we were looking at the law. In our state, if you sell property that doesn't belong to you while the owner is in a medical facility, it's not just a civil matter. It's theft by deception and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Every single person who bought my records, my tools, and my furniture was technically in possession of stolen goods. "Frank, are you sure you want to go this far?" Arthur asked me, his glasses sliding down his nose as he reviewed the list of buyers I had pulled from Martha's iPad. "This will trigger a police investigation. Your wife and kids won't just be broke, they could face serious charges." I looked at the photo on his desk of a happy family and then thought about my empty living room. "They didn't just take my things, Arthur. They tried to take my mind. They wanted to lock me away in a room and watch me wither while they spent my sweat and blood. Yes, I'm sure." I began contacting the buyers. I didn't threaten them. I spoke to them as a grieving man. I told them that my, quote, 36 had been unauthorized, and that the police would soon be visiting every house on the list to reclaim stolen property. However, I offered them a choice. Return the items voluntarily, provide a statement against Martha and Emily, and I wouldn't press charges against the buyers. The fear in their voices was palpable. People hate being caught up in family drama, but they hate the police at their door even more. The trap was set. My family was celebrating a victory that was built on quicksand. The atmosphere in the house shifted from cold indifference to a frantic, vibrating tension. Martha was no longer humming as she looked at kitchen tiles. She was pacing. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. It turned out that my, quote, 37 calls to the buyers had worked faster than a wildfire. Quote, 38. I heard her shouting in the hallway. Quote, she slammed her phone down and turned to see me standing by the empty fireplace. For a second, a flicker of suspicion crossed her eyes. Quote, she barked. I forced my eyes to go wide and watery, the picture of confusion. I let my voice trail off into a pathetic mumble. She let out a huff of disgust, convinced once again that I was just a senile burden. She didn't have time to worry about me. She had angry customers demanding their money back and threatening to report her for fraud. The real blow came that afternoon. A courier arrived at the door. Martha signed for the envelope, thinking it was the final contract for the house sale. Instead, when she ripped it open, her face turned a sickly shade of gray. It was a formal cease and desirable notice, and a lis pendens on the property. In plain English, it meant the house was legally locked. It couldn't be sold, mortgaged, or even painted until a court-ordered investigation into the, quote, 44, quote, was completed. Emily and David rushed over an hour later. The, quote, 45 group chat was clearly falling apart. David was sweating, his expensive shirt stained under the arms. Quote, 46, he hissed in the kitchen. Quote, 47. I sat in the corner, hidden by the shadows of the empty dining room, listening to them eat each other alive. They weren't a family anymore. They were a pack of panicked thieves, realizing the door to the vault had locked behind them. They had sold my life for a few weeks of luxury, and now the bill was coming due. Desperation has a specific smell. It's the scent of cold sweat and cheap lies. By Thursday, the house felt like a pressure cooker. Martha, Emily, and David were no longer ignoring me. They were hovering around me like vultures, their faces tight with a fake, terrifying kindness. They knew the legal walls were closing in, and they were looking for a way out. "Frank, honey," Martha said, sitting next to me on the floor, because there were no chairs left. She took my hand, her fingers trembling. "There's been a small misunderstanding with the bank, a little clerical error. They need you to sign this one last paper to clear everything up. It just says that you gave us permission to manage your things while you were sick. It's just a formality to stop those mean people from calling the house." I looked at the paper. It wasn't a bank form. It was a retroactive power of attorney and a confession that I had authorized every single sale on Facebook Marketplace. If I signed that, my lawsuit would vanish, and they would be legally protected, while I would be left with nothing. I whispered, squinting my eyes as if they were failing. David urged, leaning over me. I could see my father's Omega watch still on Tyler's wrist as he stood in the doorway, watching the scene. "If you don't sign this, we might lose the house. You don't want us to be homeless, do you?" The irony was sickening. They were trying to guilt-trip the man they had already made homeless in his own soul. I watched them exchange frantic glances. They were broke. The buyers were demanding refunds they couldn't provide because the money had already been spent on Emily's designer bags and David's debt. They were drowning, and they thought I was the life jacket they could just puncture and toss away. I said, seeing the flash of greedy relief in their eyes. Martha froze. I took the pen, my hand shaking violently on purpose. I scrawled a jagged, unrecognizable mess at the bottom of the page. It wasn't even a name. It was just a series of loops. They snatched the paper away like it was made of gold, not even bothering to look at the signature. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they didn't realize the, quote, 57 man had just handed them a useless piece of scrap paper. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The morning of the, quote, 58 quote arrived. The house was cold, echoing, and filled with the smell of cheap desperation. Martha was wearing her best dress, and the realtor, Mr. Henderson, was standing in the empty foyer with a couple of wealthy-looking buyers. They were discussing the quote 59 of the space, talking about knocking down walls I had built with my own hands. My family stood off to the side, wearing masks of grief, ready to play the part of the heartbroken caretakers, moving their quote 60 father to a better place. Mr. Henderson said, pulling out a thick folder. I chose that exact moment to stand up. I didn't use my cane. I stood up straight, the limp gone, the fog in my eyes replaced by a sharp, piercing stare. I walked into the center of the room, and the air seemed to vanish. Martha's face went from smug satisfaction to a ghostly, terrified white. "There will be no sale today," I said, my voice booming in the empty hall. "And there will be no more lies." Mr. Henderson blinked, confused. "Mr. Frank? I thought you were unable to participate." "I am the sole owner of this property," I said, handing him a folder Arthur had prepared. "Those signatures my wife provided are forged. The incapacity papers are fraudulent. And, as of 10 minutes ago, a criminal complaint has been filed against Martha, Emily, and David for grand larceny and elder exploitation." The buyers backed away as if the house were on fire. Emily started to scream, calling me a selfish old man, but her voice died when 2 police officers stepped through the front door. They weren't there for me. They were there to serve the warrants. I looked Martha dead in the eye as the officers began to read them their rights. The look of pure, panicked realization on their faces was the best medicine I'd had in months. They had spent the money. They had nothing. To stay out of prison, they would have to spend the next several years working every hour of every day to buy back the life they tried to steal from me. The house is finally quiet again. It took 6 months of legal battles and a mountain of police reports, but one by one, my things started coming home. My daughter Emily had to sell her new car to buy back my grandfather's watch from Tyler's wrist. My son David spent his entire savings tracking down my vinyl collection from collectors across 3 states. Martha? She's living in a tiny studio apartment now, working 2 jobs just to pay off the legal settlements and the refunds to the buyers she defrauded. I'm sitting in my original leather wingback chair now. It smells like old books and justice. The workshop is full again, and though my left hand isn't as strong as it used to be, I've learned to adapt. I'm not past tense anymore. I am a man who survived a stroke and a betrayal, and I am stronger for it. I spend my mornings listening to my records, and my afternoons teaching woodworking to veterans at the local center. I've realized that while they could sell my things, they could never sell my spirit. I'm living my best life, surrounded by the history I built, and for the first time in 40 years, the air in this house is clean. Looking back at the empty rooms I returned to, I sometimes wonder if I was too harsh. But then I remember the look in their eyes when they thought I was helpless. I reclaimed my life by holding them accountable to the very last penny. Do you think I did the right thing by involving the police and forcing my own family into a corner? Or was I too cruel to my own blood? What would you have done if you came home to find your entire life sold on the internet? If you enjoyed this story of cold revenge and ultimate justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another incredible story. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. I read every single one of them. Your support means the world and helps us bring more of these stories to light. The end. Thank you for listening.